Good evening and welcome to Nashville. I'm Alan Jackson and I'm glad you could visit with us tonight. Our subject is your hard-earned income, how the government collects it and all too often spends far more than it collects. While more and more people are shopping at dollar stores and the Price Club, the people in charge of the spending in Washington, especially at the Pentagon, act as if they have no idea and no desire to make ends meet. Well, if this sounds like something you've heard before, you're right. It was back in the 1980s when the Pentagon got singled out for paying $436 for a hammer. A decade later, it was $999 for one pair of pliers. Well, armed with that information, I've started collecting tools. If this is worth $600 and these are worth $900, send me your tools. We will broker a deal with the Pentagon. Sounds like an opportunity to me. Well, they spent even more when the 2024 spending authority was running out, approving $33 billion in the last week available. The spending goes well beyond hardware. In just the last month of the fiscal year, the military spent $6 million on lobster tails and another $6 million on ribeye steak. Now that's a lot of top-notch dinners on your and my dime. Well, the grand total for defense spending in the current fiscal year is over $850 billion. It's a global record. Don't misunderstand, we're all for a strong defense. It's critical for our nation to exist. With all the trouble in the world, we must have the best weapons and other gear possible and the best paid forces as well. What I'm talking about today is waste, and waste when you're using other people's money. Well, tonight we have the benefit of talking to a world-class expert on the subject. He's the Chief Executive Officer of an organization called Open the Books. It's a nonprofit that monitors the federal budget, line by line. John Hart, thank you for joining us tonight.
Well, Pastor Allen, it's an honor to be with you. And I didn't know this was going to be a tool show, but I did notice I have a screwdriver on my desk.
Hey, send them to Nashville. We're going to broker something.
Yeah, I'll send you the invoice for that.
All right. Well, I can't resist starting with those lobster tails. Open the Books clearly drills down on specifics, even the surf and turf offerings. Am I right?
You got it. You got it. Yeah, and Pastor, that is a great place to start, because when you think about the Pentagon, that's an area where, I'm a constitutional conservative. I believe that we ought to constrain government and put it back within the boundaries that our founders envisioned. And that concept of ordered liberty is really at the heart of what we're doing. We're a first principles organization. We believe in transparency. That transparency is the building block of a free society. And when we have real transparency, that's not a two-way street. In other words, you have the right as a taxpayer to inspect the government's checkbook. The government does not have the right to inspect your checkbook or debank you if you don't go along with what the ideological standard is of the regime in power. So this is a critically important issue where every citizen in this country, they have a right to let their voice be heard. They have a right to hold elected officials accountable, and particularly when it comes to our national defense. So the example you pointed to, part of that comes about because there's a crazy rule within our budgeting called use it or lose it, where at the end of every fiscal year, which happens in September, that agencies feel compelled to throw and shovel billions and billions of dollars out the door that they don't need to spend, because they're afraid that if they don't spend it, Congress will then cut their budget the next year. But in any sort of normal business, in a family, if you have money left over, you don't just throw it away. You may have a party at the end of the year, you may go on vacation, but you go on vacation with your money, not someone else's money. And you also put some of it away so that if you have a bad year next year, you have money to lean on. So what happened in the last 5 years of fiscal year 2024 in September under the Biden administration, we spent $33 billion in just 5 days. And Pastor, that's more than what Israel spends every year on national defense. They spend about $27 billion. And then in that last month, we spent $79 billion, which is more than the defense budget of every country on earth except for 4. And it went for things like the lobster tail and ribeye steak. That's $22 million for lobster tail and ribeye. And that may be delicious, but deliciousness is not a deterrent in a dangerous world. And we spent $200 million on new furniture. And again, you may want to upgrade the desks at the Pentagon, but when you have a country like China threatening to invade Taiwan, where he's not going to be deterred by having those new pieces of new furniture as an obstacle on the shores for his landing craft. And so we need to have some common sense in how we budget and how we prioritize. And we really need to honor the people who are putting their lives on the line and also the taxpayers that are footing the bill for this money.
Well, if I understand correctly, your mission is to dig into government spending with the goal of transparency. It's not judgment. Judgment will be left to the voters and the politicians they elect. Am I right on that?
Absolutely, yeah. Our goal is to put every dollar online in real time. And I worked for the late Senator Tom Coburn, and he wrote a bill back in 2006. It was a bipartisan bill with a young senator named Barack Obama. We passed this together, called the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act. That put all federal spending online for the first time in history. And then Open the Books was enabled by that legislation. And Open the Books looks not just at federal spending, but state and local as well. And it's based on this idea that again, taxpayers, individual Americans have the right to know what government is doing with their money. Again, it's not a two-way street. The government doesn't have the right to conduct surveillance on your checkbook, but you absolutely have not just the right, but the opportunity and obligation as a citizen in a free country to know what government's doing and then make your own decision about whether you want more lobster tail at the end of the year or whether you may want to have better paid military or another submarine or aircraft carrier to deter threats that are a threat to your future and your kids' future.
And just to clarify, you aren't criticizing the lobster tail purchases, you're just making the information available. President Trump is going full steam ahead on this topic. Listen to what he says.
I will direct all members of my cabinet to marshal the vast powers at their disposal to defeat what was record inflation and rapidly bring down costs and prices. The inflation crisis was caused by massive overspending.
Sounds to me like the steak and lobster is in some serious jeopardy.
Yeah. It is. It is. Yeah, and just to back up, that's a really important point that President Trump talked about. Is that Alan? When we think about these issues of budgets, I always think about the pie dilemma. Okay, like eating the holiday pie at Thanksgiving or Christmas. Often we think it's a fixed pie and you only have to cut it in certain sizes. Well, in an economy, you want the pie to grow, and it's really important to not just think about downsizing government, but you have to expand the economic pie at the same time. And you do that by actually limiting government spending and shifting dollars back to the private sector. So I believe that every dollar saved in Washington is a dream realized somewhere in America. It's an opportunity for an entrepreneur, a family to pursue happiness on their terms without the government dictating that whether they have to buy lobster tail or ribeyes. And when you trust we the people to make those decisions, you get a far better economic benefit than if you trust only a handful of unelected bureaucrats or even elected politicians in Washington.
Makes sense. Well, hold on to your wallets. We'll be right back with John Hart after this break. If you'd like to jump in on this conversation, you can write me an email now. Send it to comments at alanjacksonnow.com. We're back with John Hart. He takes more than a magnifying glass to the federal budget. He uses spreadsheets and, get this, common sense. Your experience on Capitol Hill prepared you to step into the helm of the Open the Books project. Tell me a little bit about your journey and how it led to where you are today.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Back when I was working on the Hill, I came to DC in the late 90s. I interned for a senator named Sam Brownback from Kansas. And my supervisor was a young guy named Paul Ryan, who went on to become Speaker of the House. And then shortly thereafter, I got connected to a wonderful member named Tom Coburn, who was a member of the House, and he was a practicing physician, citizen legislator, and had 3 incredible years with him and wrote a book with him called Breach of Trust, How Washington Turns Outsiders into Insiders. And Coburn was really part of the pre-Tea Party movement. He was kind of the godfather of the Tea Party movement. And then to fast forward, he ended up, leaving. He honored his term limits pledge and then ran for the Senate in 2004, was elected. And I worked for him for a decade. Now, when Coburn got to the Senate, he knew exactly what he wanted to do with these new powers you have as a senator. You have a lot more procedural authority. And he would call agency heads and say, hey, how many programs are you running? Can you tell me about them? And they said, well, Senator, I'll have to get back with you on that. So he had cabinet secretaries who had no idea how many programs were in the federal government. We would have appropriations committee staffers send us an unsearchable PDF of spending bills to make it hard for him to know what was in the bill. Now, what they would do is they would take a regular Word file or Excel spreadsheet and turn it into an unsearchable file just to throw up a roadblock. So he was so upset about that, he ended up passing a bill called the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act that put all federal spending online for the first time. And the vision is that would empower an ecosystem of organizations to put permanent downward pressure on spending. Again, just to ask the question of elected officials, why are we spending money on these things? Do we want to see more money on DEI spending, more money on lobster, more money on ribeye steaks and new furniture? Or do we want to make sure we spend money on things like basic infrastructure, things that really have a good bang for the buck? And from that legislation, there really were groups that started. Open the Books came out of that. A wonderful man named Adam Andrzejewski he took this acorn of an idea that Coburn planted and then grew a mighty oak out of it. And Adam sadly and tragically passed away unexpectedly a few months ago. And that's why I decided to step into this role, because the mission is so critical and important right now in our country's future. And there's no shortage of targets. We're in a very target-rich environment when it comes to government waste. And I believe very deeply in this idea of we the people. And I think we have a historic opportunity it's a 1989 moment for America, where we have an opportunity to tear down the bureaucratic wall that has separated we the people from their government. And really the project of the progressive movement over the past 100 years has been to build this administrative state that's taken power and agency and authority away from individuals and concentrated it in the hands of unelected bureaucrats in Washington. And we have an opportunity to take that power back. And our organization was really built for this moment, to help the people of goodwill in the administration and Congress to get the information they need to make real and lasting and durable change.
Yeah, I agree. We can't fail in this moment. Open the Books has cited the Biden administration for misinformation and also for delays in providing information. But isn't this a problem throughout both parties up until now? Listen to Republican Joni Ernst.
Yeah. My proposal includes selling off thousands of vacant and underutilized buildings, auditing the IRS to fire the thousands of employees who owe tens of millions of dollars in unpaid taxes, pulling the plug on Biden's billion-dollar boondoggles for gravy trains that never leave the station, and electrical vehicle stations that aren't charging up anything but debt.
Does her comment give you any better hope that the Congress as a whole might address the debt?
No, it does. And Senator Ernst is one of the great leaders. She's a part of the DOGE caucus in the Senate. We're working closely with them and also the DOGE caucus in the House. And, people always complain about presidential authority in Washington, D.C., but I can tell you the biggest problem in Washington is not executive overreach, it's legislative underreach, is that we need every senator operating like Joni Ernst and putting out their ideas and their list of savings, because I guarantee you, if Congress puts a really good bill that downsizes the administrative state in front of President Trump, let's see if he vetoes that. I think he's probably going to sign it. So there's nothing stopping Congress from really doing the hard work of legislating and downsizing these agencies. And, Pastor, we're doing a project at Open the Books. We're looking at all 441 agencies listed in the Federal Register. The first thing we discovered is that 75 are effectively ghost agencies. They're doing nothing. So the Trump administration can credibly claim today that they can just cut the number of agencies by about 20% just by showing up for work and minding the store. And that's before we even look at what they're actually doing. But we're going agency by agency, and the first one we asked was Department of Education. Hey, give us all the outlay data, all the spending data, but also your head count. And we asked this under the Biden administration, and they said, well, we'll get that information to you in 9 months. And that's unacceptable. So we're going to go back to the Trump administration and say, look, we need this information. It's in your interest to give taxpayers this information today, not wait months and months and months, because we need to have a debate in this country about why do we have all these agencies that don't provide any benefit for taxpayers, and then just go agency by agency by agency. I'm a big fan of Mike Rowe, the dirty jobs.
Yes.
And that's really how the mentality that we need in Washington is. We need people who are willing to jump in the swamp and do the hard, dirty work of identifying where the waste is. We need less talk and more action. And thankfully, there are a lot of members who really are committed to doing that hard work.
Well, very quickly, I'm curious, do you think the tax bill will be approved before the end of the year?
I do, yeah, I do. I think there will be at least, I don't know if there's going to be one or two big quote reconciliation bills, but I do. It's critical to get that done because, again, I mentioned earlier this issue of these pies where you absolutely have to solve this problem two ways. You've got to constrain the stupid spending that's low priority, but you absolutely have to have economic growth and focus not on growing federal agencies, but growing your agency and the agency of every individual in this country by giving them more, letting them keep more of what they earn. And again, that's done by both good tax policy and good spending policy.
Well, John Hart, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I hope you'll come back and keep us up to date on where our money's going.
Would love to. Thanks so much, Pastor.
All right. Well, in a moment, I want to share some thoughts on how we can all deal with and get through the very tragic crash of the passenger plane and military helicopter in Washington. We'll be right back. You know, I suspect most have heard about the tragic collision in Washington, D.C. between the airline and a military helicopter. Horrible circumstance. There's no other way to put that. If you haven't yet taken a moment to pray for the families involved and all surrounding that, please do so. You know, sometimes when there's a tragedy, I hear people respond, we have to do something more than pray. And I would agree that prayer in and of itself is not the ultimate solution, but I would stridently say that until we have prayed, the rest of the activity is really just busy work. The prayer is an invitation to God into the midst of a circumstance. And then God can do whatever God chooses to do, but we want to be certain that we have extended that invitation to Almighty God into the midst of a tragedy, into the midst of our daily lives. So if you haven't yet prayed for those families involved in that circumstance, please take a moment to do that. You know, when there's a tragedy, it reminds all of us that our days ultimately are in God's hands. I think we far too often live arrogantly, presumptively, imagining we plan our lives years in advance, and the reality is every breath is a gift. Let's live each day as if it's a gift from God, and we will find joy in that moment and in that day. If we will choose that pattern, I promise you, there's more reasons for hope than there are for despair. Well, stay with us. When we return, we're going to turn the mic to your emails. Thank you for taking the time to send your emails. I always enjoy reading your perspectives and your questions. Janet D. from Pennsylvania wrote, I just want to comment on politics from the pulpit. You say often that you're called out for it. You put it in context in teaching, saying Jesus was political. I love your teaching. What this Washington Episcopal bishop did was outrageous. What she was saying from her pulpit is not biblical or edifying. This is my opinion. Well, Janet, I don't really disagree with your opinion. I do believe it's important that our Christianity engage the culture in which we live. I don't really think that's political. I think politicians in our system of government reflect the hearts of the people in the heart of America. If we don't like our politicians and their perspectives and their policies, we have to have a heart change. Politicians just want to vote, but our Christianity has to get outside the walls of our churches and beyond the boundaries of our Sunday school classes and our small groups, or it remains just a theory. And theoretical Christianity won't change the world or a human heart. It's got to be lived out in the real world. Carolyn Kirshner from Georgia said, I've just finished reading Hoodwinked by John Amanchukwu. I couldn't put it aside and was so amazed at all the truths that he revealed concerning today's issues. It's a book every person in our country should absorb as required reading. I watched your program the night you hosted the author. Thank you for recommending his book. Carolyn, I agree. It's a great read. It's a fascinating insight, just an honest perspective on our current culture. And John frames those 10 lies that Americans have believed so clearly and concisely that I think it brings course correction to anyone who will take the time to read it. And then Karen Hess emailed, I look forward to your shows nightly and your sermons on Sundays. We need more of your Bible-based information and inspiration. It's food for thought and, more importantly, for our souls. May God bless you and keep you. Well, Karen, thanks for your blessings and your prayers. And just in case you're not in the habit of watching nightly, I will remind you, you can see us on TBN, or you can find us on on YouTube. They post the programs every evening. The information is on the screens, so you can find it at your leisure. If you haven't yet, let me invite you to take a moment and send your emails to comments@alanjacksonnow.com. I might even read them on the program. Your feedback and questions, they do a lot to shape our show. I'm Alan Jackson. You have a wonderful evening.